Okay, so today I'm going to show you guys some really neat, nifty tricks on doing your Audi front brakes. If you're just doing the brake pads and rotors, I'm going to show you all the tools and stuff that you're going to need for that. You're going to need a pry bar if you do things the way that I do them, or a flathead screwdriver, a pair of pliers, a pick, a hammer, a beaver wagon, and I call it a beaver wagon because if you want to pick up chicks, you got to have some money, so you need to be able to pick up cars. So that's my beaver wagon. A couple of impacts, 21 millimeter, 14 millimeter, 10 millimeter, and 12 millimeter, 17 millimeter. Some wire cutters, some zip ties to hold up the caliper when you take it off of there, and if all else fails, a lighter, just in case you decide to set this thing on fire. Probably not going to be doing that today. Some pliers and stuff. Now, if you've got champagne wishes on a beer budget, don't worry, Clayboy's got you. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to remove the original front braking system, which is a 4-piston Brembo brake system, and we're going to install it with a single piston, regular conventional brake system. There's nothing to this. This is super simple, super easy. It's more about getting the right components to be able to switch it over. Originally on the vehicle, it came with a 13.5-inch rotor. We're going to be switching them to a 12.5-inch rotor. We're going to be going from the 4-piston to the single piston. So we're going to need the single piston brake pads, which look like this. The 4-piston brake pads, which look like this, which cover a much bigger distance on the rotor. You get almost a whole inch of extra stopping power with the Brembo brakes. It's not because we need to do that. These calipers originally from Audi are a couple weeks away, and we couldn't get any locally sourced, so it was, not only was it cheaper to buy the single calipers, rotors, and pads locally, we can also sell the 2 calipers we take off of there and get more money for them. This isn't a race car, this is a pavement pounder, so we're going to continue its pavement pounding ways, even though it's got like almost 350 horse or something. I don't know how much these have, these supercharged ones, but it's pretty sweet. We're going to go ahead and start removing this stuff, and I'm going to show you how to switch this over. I'm going to talk to you about some of the tips and tricks that I do, that I've learned over the last couple of decades of doing this, and I'm going to even show you how to delete them brake sensors if you're super cheap. Remember, you're the one who had champagne taste on a beer budget. I'm just here to help you keep on that beer budget. Now there's 2 different ways to jack this vehicle up. You can jack it up underneath the control arm like I'm going to do, or you can jack it up underneath the pinch welds on the side of the car. Now on this vehicle, they have a pretty decent subframe, so we could jack it up underneath there. It would just take it longer for us to get the vehicle up because the strut would be decompressing as we lift it up. And I'm just going to go underneath the control arm because eventually I'm going to turn that wheel so it's easier to get access to my caliper. Now I've got that jacked up underneath my control arm, I can go ahead and start removing my wheel. This hole is located here so we can take a pick tool and we can stick it in there and pull it off. You don't want to pull this off with the screwdriver on the outside edges because it could damage it and break it. It's got a little snap ring in the center of there that locks it down right into the center of here. So when you go to put it back on, you can put it anywhere. Now, if you don't have spancy-pantsy impacts like I do, leave your tire on the ground, loosen up your 17 millimeter lug nuts, then raise it up, and then take the lug nuts off the rest of the way. So YouTube, my name is Clay here in Muskegon, Michigan. And if this video is helpful, please consider subscribing, clicking the notification, sharing my videos, and giving me them sweet old thumbs up. And if I was able to help you today, at nighttime, open up your laptop computer, turn that old volume down, and put on one of my sweet Clayway playlists. We don't make $1 billion here. It's actually very, very tough to survive off of YouTube income alone, trust me. If you've got a question for me, you can hit me up on Clay's AC and Auto Repair on the Facebook Messenger. I'll try to answer any question you have as long as it's automobile related and not baby mama drama stuff. I can't help you with that kind of thing. Remember, if anyone else can do it, I promise you, you can do it too. If when you go to reassemble this, there's a pin sticking out, because on some models, they have pins sticking out that go back in the back of the wheel, make sure you take special note of where that's at. To get your rotor off, you're gonna need an impact and a Torx for that. And in this particular situation, this is a T30, and we use a hammer. We put this up in here. Sometimes you can just quite simply screw these out, but that's generally not often the case. And we want to make sure that we keep that screw and don't lose it, because it holds the rotor to the wheel bearing. If you do lose that screw, you can either put just about any kind of screw, even one with a head, because it doesn't make contact, and there's gaps inside here, inside the hole, so even if you used a regular bolt, it wouldn't be a big deal. But even if you left it out, what's going to end up happening is the hub's going to want to spin, and it's going to be hard to line up your bolts. But it's not 100% necessary that that's there, but it sure does make it a lot easier. Now I've taken my wheel and I've turned it this way so it's easier for me to get these components off that need to come off. Now the brake sensor can be disassembled two different ways. Up underneath it, and which is the reason I didn't really want to show this, is there's supposed to be a little locking collar on there, but you take a pick tool and you pry it off there gently, and as long as you don't break the back side of it, you can generally reuse it. You'll see a little U-shaped clip that goes on there that you leave inserted onto the brake sensor itself and reinstall the brake pad. But 9 out of 10 times, because these things heat up and expand and contract, and this is just plastic, they break off when you go to take them off there. So we're going to try to conduct a test and see if we can find the resistance or whatever is supplied to this, and see if we can bypass these brake sensors. I've decided that I'm leaving that out of this video. I'm going to make a separate video showing you how to bypass it and what the resistance is. So you can look that up on my Audi playlist. Now I'm going to take a punch and I'm going to put it inside here, and I'm going to punch these pins backwards. They're holding this clip up to the top of here. Now I'm going to take a pair of pliers and hopefully work this back. That'll alleviate the pressure on the other pin. Okay, so let's say you get that pin a little bit out and you can't get it out the rest of the way. You can grab onto it and you can push it this way. I need right where my camera is going to be able to grab this. Now, once you get that past the clips far enough, you should be able to pull it out. Now, in my situation, because I used this short punch, I kind of bent mine a little bit. So if I was replacing these brakes, I would need to replace this pin too, because it being bent is no good. Okay, so if you were not replacing the rotor, in this situation, we could decompress the caliper and just change out the brake pads. And I'm going to show you how I do it. But because I'm replacing the rotor, I don't have to worry about damaging the rotor surface. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a screwdriver and I'm going to bang it in right about here and as close to the center as possible. Then with that screwdriver, I'm going to push it pressure backwards, and it's going to free up this brake pad. Now we only have to get it in there just a little bit, and then we just apply pressure. We don't have to force it, and you don't have to force it quick. What you're doing is you're sending brake fluid back up the brake line right here. This generally does not damage the rotor because the rotor surface is harder than the screwdriver or the brake pad material. But we have to get the brake pads, the brake cylinders moved all the way in. Lean back and constantly apply pressure to it till your brake pad cylinders are all the way in. And then hopefully we can just take a pick And we may be able to lift out this brake pad. So with our brake cylinders all the way down, we would be able to just slip our new one inside there, but we've also got to do it the same thing to the other side as well. Now, if you've done everything correctly, you would be able to slide in your new brake pads. Now, the reason that you wouldn't necessarily want to just drop them in there is because your brake caliper may be seized and not able to go this way. So we would want to make sure that we take out the bolt securing the brake caliper to the brake caliper bracket, and make sure that our pins slide back and forth. So right now I'm going to go ahead and remove this caliper. Now, because I'm actually switching the caliper to the lesser expensive calipers, I'm going to take a brake clamp tool and I'm going to put it right here on the brake line, and I'm going to loosen up my 10 millimeter. I'm not going to be able to remove the 10 millimeter without taking the caliper off. And on this particular style caliper, this does not come apart. It just comes off, and there's two 21 millimeter bolts in the back that remove it. Now I've got my brake line clamped off because I don't want it to sit here and lose all the fluid out of there. You need to be careful and mindful that you clamp the line on a rubber portion of the line. We don't want to restrict this line off, and it's always a good idea if you're replacing calipers to replace these lines anyways, but in this situation we're not going to do that. I forgot and misspoke. This is a 14 millimeter brake line, and I've got it loose, and I just loosen it up. Once I get it off, I take the caliper and I spin the caliper out of the way. We do not want to be spinning these rubber brake lines to remove it. Now, for all the whiny babies on YouTube that if you let the caliper hang by the hose, that don't understand that it's your vehicle and you're working on it and you can do whatever you want, you can hang up your caliper by some zip ties. It's a good idea. Heaven forbid you ever break this rubber hose that should be replaced anyways every time you do brake calipers, but you know, who am I to judge? Let's say you take off your brake hose and it's still dripping a little bit and you've got your clamp on there. Just tighten it up. You don't really have anything to worry about. There shouldn't be any air past this area right here, and we're going to bleed the new caliper out when we put it on. Now, with your bolt removed out of your caliper, if it still doesn't come off, just take a BFH and hit the crap out of that thing. Now, anytime you're doing new brake rotors, they're coated with an oil from the factory so they don't get all rusty. Even if brake rotors are all rusty, it doesn't affect their stopping ability, and it doesn't deteriorate them quickly. They're generally going to be rusty on areas where the brake pad's not making contact. So that's why you always use a rag, and you fold that thing up and you spray it down with some brake cleaner. Once it's set on its side, you use the side that you coated and rub the rotor to take off that oil. Now we're going to go ahead and install our brake caliper. Now, our 4-piston brake caliper doesn't have a separate brake caliper bracket from the brake caliper, but even if you were reinstalling your 4-piston caliper, you're definitely going to want to use some red Loctite on these bolts, and you want to torque these bolts down real hard. Now, the difference between the 4-piston caliper and the single-piston caliper is this is a floating caliper. So that basically means that it has bolts that it floats on. These bolts that it's floating on do not have to be that tight. On a lot of applications, mostly domestic, they're going to have a really thin area where the bolts go into on them style. And it's easy to strip them out. Just remember that the pins that the calipers are riding on are just pins. Even though they screw in like bolts, they don't have to be ultra tight. You can generally snug them down to 25 or 30 foot-pounds, and that's good enough. But on the main caliper bracket bolts, that's these big ones right here, you definitely want to use Loctite on them. Because if these bolts come off and you've got big old wheels on there, your caliper could come off, and we don't want to see that happen. A little dab of Loctite is really all you need. It looks like I put a lot on there, but I didn't. That's just a couple little dots. Now, if you're going and reinstalling brake calipers, you need to make sure that these slides move. If they do not move, you need to pull them out of the barrel, take some sandpaper and clean them off, and then put dielectric grease or brake grease like they try to sell you at AutoZone, which is a big waste of money. But you need to make sure these slide back and forth. If you don't, your pads are going to wear unevenly and prematurely fail. So it's really, really critical that in any brake system, these slide back and forth like they're supposed to. Now we look closely at the brake line we're going to install, and this is a pipe fit, meaning that it's smaller at the bottom and gets larger at the top. We're going to go ahead and screw this in, and we need to snug it down. We don't have to reef this down. We just snug it down with our wrench. Once we get it just about tight, and we can't turn it anymore by hand by spinning the caliper onto here, then we put it on the frame and then snug it up with our 14mm wrench, and she'll be good to go. Then we take the clamp off and check and make sure it's not leaking right there. Immediately, once we take this clamp off, brake fluid is going to start entering the brake caliper, and if we have the brake bleeder loose, it'll push that air out of there at the same time. Then we tighten up the brake bleeder and we make sure it doesn't leak around our fitting. We should be good to go and start with our bleed procedure, which is super simple, y'all. Now, our brake pads have to be installed onto our brake cup prior to installing our caliper on there. There's a little notch that is on the back of the other brake pad that fits down inside this hole right here, and that needs to sit inside that hole. Don't worry, I am going to show you how to install that spring that goes on the outside of here. I don't know if this is typical of this style or not, but this needs to be inserted down inside the cup first, like so, and then you push this up into here. Holding our brake pads as we put our caliper onto our rotor, and then putting our caliper into place and setting them over the pins is how you want to do this. Now, as you're installing them into place, make sure that you push these back so they go over the tops of the pins properly, and your brake pads are sitting down on your pins correctly. Now, when you go to install your rear bolts on the back of your brake caliper, all you should have to do is wiggle it a little bit and then get the bolts into place, and then you can start screwing them in by finger. And once they feel like they're tightening, you've got them located in the right place. If your brake line is installed correctly, you should only be able to turn this about a half a turn before it starts to snug up. Once it's snugged up, it's tight. Before we remove our clamp, we're going to go ahead and loosen up our brake bleeder so the air will push through there. Now, within 30 seconds, we could basically see some little bubbles coming out right there. And we can let it do that for a couple moments, probably put something underneath there to catch it. And then we go ahead and snug that back up once we stop seeing air bubbles. Now, making sure everything is tightened down before we go to the last step of the bleed procedure. When you're by yourself, we're going to go ahead and install this spring onto the front of this caliper. Now, the procedure that I use to do this is I take it and I put it inside there. I get the little tab that's right here, right inside here, have this wedged up against here. Then I take a pair of pliers and I put them up inside there. And voila. I don't know if there's a tool for doing that, but that's how I do it, or how I learned how to do it on the last one, so I could show you folks. But there you go. Okay, so we're going to start our last portion of our bleed procedure, which is very, very simple. Now, we need to think about a brake system. Fluid travels down, and it's always traveling downward, and that's why our master cylinder is up inside our cabin or up inside our engine compartment, way far above the front and the rear brakes. That allows the fluid to always be traveling down, and that's why brake fluid will leak if you have a broken line until it all leaks out. So, quite simply, since we didn't introduce any air up into our lines above this, all we need to do is go inside the vehicle, pump up the brake pedal with the bleeder closed, and then open the bleeder, let some fluid drip out, watch for bubbles and drips, and you usually only have to do that about once. You don't usually have to do it 2 or 3 times, but that's a way you can do it by yourself. The vehicle does not have to be on or started, and generally you should get only 1 to 2 pumps before it's nice and solid. And we're going to go in back over here, and we're going to loosen the bleeder, and we should be able to see air come out of it immediately. Yep. See that one little boop boop there? A couple more. Now, if your brake pedal is nice and firm, you're good to go. Now, most of the time on your brake fluid cap, it's either going to tell you the brake fluid type that goes inside there, or tell you to look in the owner's manual. You can check the brake fluid level. In my situation, I didn't have a brake fluid loss, so I don't really have too much to worry about. But I just want to make sure it's up to snuff. And because I have plenty of brake fluid in there, I'm just going to double check myself before I wreck myself. Make sure I don't have any little air bubbles going. Looks good to me. So now all we have to do is put our wheels back on, torque everything down, take her for a test drive, and it turned out perfect. The brake light wasn't on, none of that stuff. Remember, if you want to check out that video of the brake pad sensor bypass, just look in my Audi playlist. I'll try to put it down in the description for you folks, just in case I don't. If you dug what I did over here, please consider subscribing, clicking the notification, sharing my videos, giving me them sweet old thumbs up. And if you've got a question for me, hit me up on Clay's AC and Auto Repair on the Facebook Messenger. I do not collect information. I just want to help people. Pay it forward. Do something kind for a stranger. Don't be the next to them. Be the first of you. Remember, if anyone else can do it, I can promise you. I promise you. You can do it too. God bless, folks. Have the best of days.